This is the Linguistics Podcast. Questions or comments can be directed to Twitter at linguistchris or via email to linguistchris@gmail.com. Hello and welcome to the Linguistics Podcast. My name is Chris, and today we're going to talk about language death. Now that sounds like a very depressing topic, and indeed in some ways it is, but I think it's one that's very important to cover, especially in a podcast of this type where I really want to talk about language as much as I can, and I sort of want to give you guys the most information as I can about language in general, and I think I would be doing you a disservice if I didn't cover language death, no matter how depressing it can be. So the first thing we need to cover is, what does it mean for a language to die? And this is sort of a strange thing, right? Well, you sort of ask yourself, is a language alive in the strict sort of biological sense? Well, clearly it's not. It's a complex adaptive system which is used by a group of people. And when you consider it that way, then when you start to think about, well, what does it mean for a language to die? Well, it means that the last of its speakers dies. It means that the last person to use this particular language dies. And therefore no one else speaks this language as a native speaker, and therefore the language is dead. So one of the sort of famous dead languages, when you think about them like that as dead languages, then you think about Latin oftentimes. So Latin is a very famous dead language in that nobody speaks Latin as a native speaker. Now, actually, I was thinking about this a while ago. There may be some exceptions to that. Some people that choose to teach someone Latin as a first language. That's certainly not impossible. However, generally speaking, around the world, nobody will speak Latin as a native speaker. And the reason for this is twofold. One, that it's simply very uncommon, and two, that we don't have any true native speakers of Latin left. So things like pronunciation are not as clear as they could be in terms of linguistic input. That being said, Latin is a very famous dead language, but it's also a very well documented dead language. So the last of its original native speakers certainly has died, and yet it's very, very well documented in written form. Okay, so we have a very good record of Latin, therefore we know very well how Latin works, and so on and so forth. It's not the case that the last speaker of Latin died without Latin being written down. And when linguists talk about language death, that's really what we're more concerned with. We're more concerned about a language falling out of usage, the last speaker dying, and not having any kind of record of that language. And that stems from the fact that it's not just known languages that die, right? There's also unknown languages which die. So if you guys are aware, a few years ago, I think at this point, actually maybe only a year and a half or 2 years ago, there was an article in the BBC News, and several other news outlets picked it up, about an uncontacted tribe, I believe somewhere in the Amazon basin. And they had several pictures of this tribe of people. The pictures were taken from a helicopter, and there were people on the ground in this clearing, and they were wearing, I believe, various types of paints, and one of them, I believe, had a spear and was holding it up sort of in defense of himself at this helicopter that they had just seen. And this apparently was a tribe that had not been contacted by anyone before. Okay, so to think about this linguistically, these people have to speak a language. We know that every person on the planet, except for some extreme and odd cases, speaks a language. Okay, so with that in mind, this particular uncontacted tribe has to have a language, and that language is unknown to the field of linguistics. In other words, we don't know anything about it. Okay, we can make assumptions based on languages in the area, based on what family of languages we think it might belong to, based on geographical distribution, but that's all that we can do. Right? We can't say anything more to that effect as to how that language works, what type of language it is, so on and so forth. Now imagine if the last speaker of that language were to die before we had a chance to hear it. So let's say the last person in this uncontacted tribe dies, and no one has written down the language. No one's even heard the language outside of other tribe members who are all also now dead. It's quite a thought when you really start to wrap your head around it. An entire communicative system used by a group of people that vanishes from the face of the earth. And it really makes you think about, well, what is the importance of documenting these things? And that's what I want to try and focus on today. And I'm going to start, well, clearly I've already started the discussion, but on my little checklist here that I've made for this episode, the way I really wanted to start the episode was by talking about Ishi. Okay, so let me move on from my hypothetical situation with the uncontacted tribe. That's a hard word for me to say for some reason. And move on to Ishii. So some of you may have heard or know about Ishii. I know at least one listener does. Ishii was the last surviving member of a group of people called the Yana, and specifically he was in a subgroup called the Yahi. And this was in California. Okay, this was a California Native American tribe of people. And Ishii, when he was around 49 years of age, I believe this was in 1911, he emerged from the wilderness near Oroville, California, and was discovered by various people. The reasons for his coming out of the wilderness, it's thought, was sort of out of desperation. He was out of supplies, I believe, and he was sort of starving for food, living alone. And so he emerged, and his first contact with anyone outside of his own sort of tribal people was in 1911, as far as we know. Now, this is interesting because when Ishii finally emerged from the wilderness, like I said, he was alone, and he was alone because the last of his kind had died. In other words, he was the last surviving member of the Yahi, and thereby the last surviving member of the Yana. And he was extensively studied at the time by an anthropologist named Alfred Kroeber. And most of this of the research around Ishi happened at UC Berkeley. And one thing that's important to note is that it was, I believe, Kroeber who gave him the name Ishi. Okay, and Ishi in the Yana language meant, notice I'm using the past tense, meant man. And it might sound strange, well, why call him Ishi if that's not really his name? Why would you just call him man in his language? And this is one of the most touching parts of the Ishi story. And when I say touching here, I actually mean just heart-wrenching parts of the Ishi story. And I should mention there are various accounts of this particular piece of the story, but I'm going to tell you guys the one which I've seen the most often and which I believe to be the most accurate. Ishi was used in place of this man's actual name. Okay, so the researchers that were studying Ishi called him that because in his culture, one cannot utter their own name, or one could not utter their own name. In other words, for him to say his own name would be against some sort of cultural boundary for him. And because there was no other surviving tribe member, no one else could utter his name than himself. And so to keep his dignity, which was, culturally based in this case, he could not say his own name, and therefore we'll never know what it was. And we simply refer to him as Ishi. So that is quite a touching story, right? A man who cannot say his own name for cultural reasons, and therefore we give him another name based on a word of his language. Now notice I say based on a word of his language. He worked with linguists, specifically one linguist who I'll mention in a second, and he provided a great deal of information on the Yana language. So much information, in fact, that I believe a complete grammar of that language does exist, even though it has no living speakers at this time. The linguist who worked with him to produce that grammar and to devise it was named Edward Sapir. And I couldn't ask for a better segue into what I'm going to go into next. So Edward Sapir is incredibly famous in the field of linguistics for his work that was done with another incredibly famous linguist named Benjamin Lee Whorf. And Sapir and Whorf together formulated over many years the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And whenever I talk about language death, which I have had the pleasure of talking about with students in the past, and it's always one of those topics that is very interesting to them because it's sort of emotionally touching. I always try and touch on the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis because I think, above all, it is the most compelling case for why languages should be documented. Okay, so let me tell you about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis here. I don't think I've mentioned it in the podcast. Basically, it centers around the idea of a world view. Okay, so in German, there's one term for this called Weltanschauung, which I think really is a better term to use because it separates worldview from the specific type of worldview that we're talking about. So when I say worldview or Weltanschauung, I say a view that is conditioned by the language that you speak. Okay, conditioned by the language that you speak. So consider this. Let's say that your particular language has more than one word for camel. Okay, so English, of course, has one word for camel, and we can describe all different kinds of camels, right? We can use adjectives to describe different types of camels. But there are languages which have more than one word, and this is an important distinction because in English we have one concept of camel, one category camel, that we then define with a more fine-grained distinction by the use of adjectives. In other languages, they may have multiple categories of camel. In other words, the concept of camel itself, at some basic cognitive level, is more split than it is in English. Okay. This gives you a good sort of insight into what the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is saying. Okay, so it says that your Weltanschauung, your worldview, is based upon these sort of cognitive divisions of categories based on the structure of your language. Okay, so if you subscribe to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, then your concept of camel, if you're an English speaker, will be one unified concept consisting of all the different types of camel. But if you're a speaker of this other language, language B, which has multiple words for camel, then your concept of camel is not one uniform concept, but multiple concepts, such that to match the English concept of camel, you have to consider multiple concepts. Now that may seem like a sort of circular distinction, perhaps. You have the same amount of information contained in each example, right? So you have in language B, if you consider those multiple concepts of camel, then you end up with the same amount of information as contained within the one concept camel. But note just the logic behind that sort of thinking. Okay, so what we're saying is that the structure of your language dictates how you think. Okay, the structure of your language dictates how you think. Your Weltanschauung is based upon the constructions in the language that you use. Not only the constructions, meaning syntactic constructions, but perhaps it's even more pervasive than that. So it could have something to do with morphological structure. It could have something to do with lexical structure. Any aspect of language is admissible in this hypothesis. And indeed, there has been good evidence given for Sapir-Whorf, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and I'm not going to go into that evidence now because I think it's sort of difficult to explain in a short amount of time. It's one of those sort of heady linguistic concepts. But it's interesting to think about because it suggests that if a language is lost, that means that a way of thinking is lost. And more importantly, if a language is lost, many, many years of human development, and by human development I mean knowledge, human knowledge development, is lost. And that's perhaps most or best illustrated by looking into popular culture, because we actually have some good resources in popular culture when we're dealing with language death. So moving on from the sapirwhorf hypothesis, which again is a reason to consider for documenting these languages, I'll move into a popular culture reference, which is The Linguists. The Linguists is a 2008 documentary film which chronicles some studies of Greg Anderson, who works for the Living Tongues Institute for Endangered Languages, and a gentleman by the name of David Harrison of Swarthmore College. And basically this film centers around 3 languages which are moribund. Now let me mention what moribund means. When you have a language that has a very limited number of speakers left, so let's say we have language X, which has, 3 speakers remaining, and they're all over 80 years of age, we would call this language moribund, because unless something very drastic is done to try and revitalize this language, in other words, to try and teach it to children as a native tongue, it will die. It will be a dead language very soon, unfortunately, because clearly people only live so long. And so this film tries to document, or at least it documents the documentation of 3 moribund languages. These languages are Chulim, which is a language spoken by people in Siberia, a particular tribe of people in Siberia, Sora in Orissa, India, and Kalawaya in Bolivia. Okay, and I'm going to talk briefly about 2 of those examples. The first one being Chulim. So Chulim is a language spoken, like I said, by a tribe of people in Siberia, and the problem that arose with Chulim is that it was socially unacceptable to speak Chulim instead of speaking Russian. And thus children started using Russian more as a socially accepted sort of variant, if you will. And thus Chulim went out of fashion, and it got to the point where people were ashamed to speak Chulim for social reasons. This isn't too hard to sort of imagine happening, right? So if you have social constraints on the use of one particular language style, we see this in English, right? So you don't go to a party and speak the same way that you would speak to a very close friend informally, right? Depending on the nature of the party, right? So if the party has a lot of people that you don't know very well, you're going to speak quite differently than if you speak with close friends. Now imagine that across 2 languages. So you have one language that you use at home, Chulim, and at school you have to use Russian because you get laughed at for speaking Chulim, even though other people can speak Chulim at school. This is a very strong reason to not use a language, and unfortunately it's led to Chulim being moribund. So it has very few speakers left, and Chulim has 2 problems. So it has few speakers left, and a good number of those speakers left don't admit that they speak Chulim because they're ashamed, again, for social reasons. So that's one thing that's talked about in this film. The other thing, and I think more interesting, and which really does illustrate the need to document languages, is the Kalawaya example. So Kalawaya is spoken in Bolivia. And what's interesting about Kalawaya is it's a so-called ceremonial language, also known as a secret language. So it's not the language spoken mostly by the tribes in question. The tribes in question, I believe, actually do speak Quechua. I could be incorrect on that, so don't quote me. However, Kalawaya is a secret language which is passed from father to son. And the reason it's passed from father to son is because it's used in ceremonies, ritual ceremonies, spiritual ceremonies. The lineage of Kalawaya is from a language family known as Pukina, which is completely extinct. So Kalawaya is the only remaining language in the entire Pukina tree. The rest of, like I said, so the most common language in the area is Quechua, also Spanish, but Kalawaya is still used for ceremonial purposes. And the interesting thing is that the tribes which use Kalawaya for ceremony, they have both spiritual and medicinal ceremonies. So in other words, medicinal treatments, herbal treatments and the like, are done in Kalawaya. They're not done in Quechua or Spanish or any other language. they're done in Kalawaya, this secret language passed down from father to son. This means that all the information about the herbal sort of remedies, the medicinal properties of herbs, is encoded into Kalawaya. Okay, it's not encoded into these other languages that they speak in everyday life. It's encoded into Kalawaya. In other words, if you want to learn how to treat someone in one of these ceremonies, you learn Kalawaya, because that's where the information is. The lexical information is stored within Kalawaya. So if you lose Kalawaya, you lose that information. It's as simple as that. If the last remaining speaker of Kalawaya dies, all that knowledge of the medicinal properties of various herbs dies with the language. And that is sort of the best case I can make for the necessity of documenting moribund languages. Because, I mean, let's be honest, once a language dies, that's it. I mean, there's no getting at the facts of that language after the last speaker is dead. And there are cases, in fact, where partial grammars exist for languages because someone was trying to document a language and the last speaker died, and what are you going to do after that? I mean, the best you can do is assume its properties based on other similar languages, but the more and more you get into that game, the more you find that it's not a good game to be in, because you can only predict so much. Especially if a language happened to be typologically rare, in other words, it didn't follow a sort of typological pattern that would be expected, and you fill in gaps with just typologically general information, you haven't correctly documented that language. Right? I mean, consider a very common language, not in any sense in danger of dying, like German. German is quite typologically rare in terms of typological patterns and typological expectations. German has structures that are not expected. It's head initial in its prepositional phrases, but head final in its verb phrases in subordinate clauses. I mean, it's a weird mix, a sort of non-optimal mix. And yet, if we didn't have a good grammar of German and the last speaker of German died and we had only marked down how it makes its prepositional phrases, we would assume that it makes its verb phrases in a way in which it doesn't. Okay, so this is the kind of thinking you have to do with these things. So it's very important not only to get these languages documented, but to do it early enough such that you can finish the entire grammar before it dies off. Now, clearly, the more optimal solution would be, well, can't we just ensure that these languages don't die? And unfortunately, that's sort of an unrealistic expectation. The reason that languages die is because of globalization. So you get one sort of prestige language that moves into an area, be it Spanish or English or German or Japanese or some other more common language, Chinese perhaps, a variety of Chinese. And that gets the prestige. That's the language people want to speak, and thus their native language of their smaller tribe, which is being increasingly forced into contact due to globalization, just gets put on the side. And that placing a native tongue on the side has disastrous consequences, linguistically speaking, because it leads to these sort of moribund situations where all of a sudden, you decided that you were going to speak mostly Russian when you were 10 because you got teased for speaking Chulim, and now you're 80 and your children never learn Chulim, and it dies with you. I mean, that's the grim reality of this sort of thing. You might say, well, how grim is that reality? And unfortunately, it's very, very grim. Globalization in terms of language seems unstoppable at this point. I've mentioned before in this podcast that one of the more accepted estimates for the total number of languages in the world is 7,000. If you want to look at it in terms of how many are endangered, so endangered languages are not just moribund languages, but languages that are in danger of becoming moribund. So this would be languages that start to have fewer than, I don't know, say 1,000 speakers. Actually, the number is probably higher than that. It's probably fewer than, maybe even 10,000 speakers might be considered endangered. So if you consider how many of those 7,000 languages are endangered, in other words, languages that could die off very soon, you can imagine about half, so 3,500 of 7,000, are in danger of dying off soon. And that's a staggering statistic, right? I mean, that's 3,500 of 7,000, 50% of the extant languages may not be extant in 100 years. That's a crazy number, especially when you consider that's due to the number of languages which dies off every 2 weeks, which is one. So one language every 2 weeks dies off. That adds up very, very quickly. Very, very quickly. One per 2 weeks. I mean, if you're one of these people that is really passionate about losing species, right? So biological extinction, and you look at the rate at which Earth loses species, and then you compare it to the rate at which Earth loses languages, you find some very shocking and disheartening similarities between these two rates. So that is, I guess I'll end there on that wonderfully optimistic note. I mean, language death is not an optimistic topic, but like I said, I didn't feel I could do you all a service without talking about it. All of the studying that we do in linguistics, all of the structures we're interested in, the problem is the field, in terms of manpower, is not as large as some other fields out there, specifically psychology. And thus we only have so many resources to put towards documentation of languages, linguistically relevant documentation of languages, right? So documentation like we should be documenting things, looking at actual language structure, copying down actual grammars for these languages such that we can reproduce utterances. That's a hard thing to do. It takes a lot of time, and linguistics does not have the manpower to do it. And thus, due to globalization, we see languages dying all the time. And it's just sort of a fact of life. And it makes things like typological study very difficult, right? Because we only have so many languages in our sort of overall sample, right? If you look at the World Atlas of Language Structures, most of the samples in that atlas are only 300 to 400 languages, so n equals 300 to 400. You can't, you sort of have to take those things with a grain of salt, right? Because if you're talking about an overall number of around 7,000, it's difficult to say, well, are these typological tendencies really valid? If we only have good information about such a small fraction of them. But that's par for the course in linguistics, is you work with what you have. And in terms of the number of available languages to study, what we have is declining every day. So that's that. Thank you guys for listening to this horribly depressing podcast. I hope it has been at least enlightening, and I hope that you, at least when you hear somebody say, language X is moribund because we think the last speaker is going to die, maybe you'll read it in an article. Some magazines like to cover some interesting language situations sometimes. You'll at least have a better perspective as to what that means and exactly what humanity as a whole will be losing when that language dies. I wanted to make one recommendation before I ended today. So I mentioned David Harrison, who is one of the linguists featured in the film The Linguists. He also has a wonderful book available, and I'd like to recommend it to all of you. It's called When Languages Die. The authorship is listed here as K. David Harrison, although in The Linguist he's just listed as David Harrison. But if you look this up, you have to put the K in front of his name to find it. It was published, I don't know. Let's take a look here. Published in 2007, so it's very recent, by Oxford University Press, and it's about 200 pages, almost 300 pages really, 250 let's say, about some studies that he's conducted with moribund languages. Chu Lim is mentioned in here, as well as several other very interesting cases. And he makes a far better case than I do, by the way, as to why these languages should be documented. Obviously, I have, 15 minutes to tell you guys a lot of information. So if you do, my hope is that my podcast here has at least inspired you to sort of look into this topic more than just this podcast, and maybe get his book, check it out from your local library, and read his arguments for why we should be documenting these languages, because they're far better than mine. And also learn about some individual cases, which are all very interesting. The difficulties in documenting some of these languages, and the necessity for doing so. That's the point of the book. Okay, so once again, I'd like to thank you all for listening, and I'll see you next time.